First introduction. The winter of 1944 didn't merely arrive. It descended like a sudden ambush, transforming the cold into a silent weapon. Without warning, without prediction, and without any safety net, an unforgiving chill enveloped a continent already devastated by warfare. Within the initial 15 seconds of that icy onslaught, a stark truth emerged. In total war, the most perilous adversary is often the one that goes unheard. Bombs had not only razed homes and streets, but had also severed the vital lifelines that provided warmth. Electrical grids lay in shambles, gas conduits were twisted metal, and coal depots smouldered in gaping craters. Every source of heat, every vestige of comfort, was either annihilated or commandeered for military purposes. Across Europe, cities languished in darkness. Families huddled together in roofless structures, where the winter wind cut through shattered walls like a razor. Soldiers shivered in frozen trenches, their damp uniforms clinging to their skin, slowly turning them to ice. As temperatures plummeted, a brutal clarity dawned. Cold was not merely weather, it was a weapon. Yet, this narrative extends beyond mere suffering. It recounts the mindset that sustained thousands through unimaginable hardship, a mindset forged not from luxury, but from an intuitive grasp of how heat behaves, how it dissipates, and how a tiny, seemingly insignificant invention would ultimately determine who survived the winter and who perished. Join us, because the lessons learned in 1944 remain profoundly relevant today. It starts with the elementary act of learning to retain warmth when the world offers none. Second, when heating systems collapsed, warmth became a rare resource. As the war reached its brutal climax, Europeans found themselves caught within structures that no longer offered protection. Civilians often slept in rooms where entire walls had been obliterated, leaving them directly exposed to the winter air. Glass windows had vanished, replaced by scraps of fabric that did little to impede the wind. Basements, once sanctuaries, transformed into damp, frigid chambers where frost patterns, shaped by the night's breath, spread across the floor. On the front lines, soldiers waged a secondary conflict against an unrelenting foe, the cold itself. Trenches filled with frozen mud, and foxholes became shallow basins of ice. Uniforms, soaked during marches, stiffened overnight, and boots froze around feet, rendering movement excruciating. Each gust of wind felt like a harbinger, signaling that warmth was gradually receding from the world. Hypothermia did not manifest dramatically. It crept in stealthily. Fingers grew numb, reflexes dulled, and thoughts became clouded. Then came the irresistible urge to sleep, a sleep from which many never awoke. Men who had endured artillery blasts, sniper fire, and starvation were ultimately defeated by the mere absence of heat. This was the harsh truth etched into human memory by World War II. The human body does not negotiate with cold. Warmth is not a luxury. It is a fundamental biological necessity. Once the systems that generated it failed, people were compelled to re-engineer warmth using whatever fragmented knowledge and materials they still possessed. What they created was neither powerful nor elegant, but it was sufficient, and in terms of survival, sufficient is often the most critical word. Third, the deadly misconception: why ordinary candles couldn't save anyone. In their desperation, many turned to the most accessible item they possessed, a simple wax candle. It offered a flame, provided light, and shimmered like hope in a darkened room. However, this hope was founded on a fatal misunderstanding. A candle can illuminate a space, but it cannot warm it. The laws of physics are uncompromising. The heat from an open flame rises directly upward, dissipating into the rafters or escaping through damaged rooftops. It does not radiate outward. It does not remain near the body. A candle burns, but the warmth it produces escapes more rapidly than it can benefit the living beings gathered around it. Thousands discovered this agonizing truth when it was already too late. They lit candles, convinced they had created a safe haven, only to find the surrounding air barely changed. The flame persisted, but they did not. This paradox, this betrayal of expectation, marks the true beginning of our story. For when people realized that fire and warmth were not synonymous, they were forced to reevaluate everything they knew about heat. That realization, born out of fear and necessity, led to the creation of one of the war's simplest yet most ingenious survival tools, a tiny heat candle designed not to squander its warmth, but to deliver it precisely where the human body needed it most. A flame alone is insufficient. Comprehending the flame is what saves you. This is the lesson etched in both ingenuity and tragedy during the harshest winters of World War II. Fourth, historical evidence. Who used the heat candle, where it appeared, and why it saved lives? To grasp how a modest, improvised heater rescued thousands, we must examine its prevalence and who relied upon it. This was no marginal device used by a handful of survivors. It emerged universally wherever the cold exerted its greatest pressure. In the final winter of the war, Germany's civilian population faced a catastrophic breakdown in fuel supplies. Coal trains ceased running, city depots stood empty, and entire regions endured weeks without heating. Families in Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, and countless smaller towns slept in semi-destroyed apartments where temperatures frequently dropped far below freezing. People scrounged for old candle stubs, cooking fat, and cardboard scraps from ruins to construct anything that could generate more than a fragile flicker. In occupied Poland and France, the situation was even more dire. Heating was rationed, monitored, and severely restricted. Stoves could not operate for long, and gathering wood was sometimes prohibited. Civilians quickly learned that a heat candle, fashioned from scavenged materials, was one of the few tools the occupying powers could not confiscate. On the front lines, soldiers discovered the same reality in foxholes and makeshift field shelters. Standard issue equipment could block wind, but could not produce heat. When temperatures plummeted and gloves stiffened into useless forms, men ignited heat candles to keep their hands agile enough to handle weapons. They used them to prevent water from freezing solid overnight. They positioned socks and rags near the slow-burning flame so they would be dry enough to wear the next morning. Civil defense manuals from Britain, Germany, and even the Soviet Union showcase nearly identical diagrams. A tin can, rolled cardboard or cloth forming a wick matrix, and wax poured over the top. These documents emphasized ventilation, carefully noting that the device was safe only when oxygen could circulate. Across battlefields, basements, and refugee shelters, the pattern was consistent. Heat candles did not warm entire rooms, nor were they intended to. Instead, they preserved circulation, protected motor function, and maintained the biological threshold between life and death. This is the point every survivor account clearly articulates. A heat candle did not save spaces, it saved bodies. For survival in the winter of 1944 did not hinge on comfort. It depended on keeping the human machine operating just long enough to witness another sunrise. 5. A spontaneous invention, when desperation turned people into engineers. One of the most remarkable aspects of the survival heat candle is its lack of a single inventor, patent, or military designation. No factory mass-produced it. It arose organically, almost simultaneously, across various nations. An invention born not from intellectual brilliance, but from sheer, desperate necessity. There was no blueprint, no central authority instructing civilians on how to build one. It was improvisation on a massive scale, driven by the same urgent logic. If a candle wastes heat upwards, then perhaps a container could capture that heat, direct it, slow its release, and extend its duration. In Warsaw, families experimented with rolled newspapers soaked in leftover paraffin. In France, resistance fighters utilized paint cans filled with cloth scraps dipped in animal fat. In Germany, children learned from neighbors how to melt wax from shattered church candles and pour it over corrugated cardboard stuffed into soup tins. And along the Eastern Front, soldiers discovered that even cooking grease could fuel a makeshift heater that burned long into the night. These designs were not identical, yet they converged on the same fundamental principle through trial and error. People observed which arrangements burned too quickly, which produced too much smoke, and which overheated the container. They shared effective methods with neighbors, whispered instructions in shelters, and disseminated ideas through letters and diaries. Innovation spread not through formal textbooks, but through the instinct for survival itself. This is why the heat candle distinguishes itself from other wartime inventions. It was not engineered from above, it was discovered from below. It represents a rare historical moment when millions of individuals, scattered across borders and divided by conflict, independently solved the same problem in almost identical ways. And therein lies the deeper lesson. The most effective survival tools in human history were not designed. They were recognized. They were the result of observing nature, respecting physical laws, and transforming available scraps into something functional. The heat candle reminds us that innovation begins the moment we stop asking what we lack and start asking what we can construct from what remains. 6th, inside a survival heat candle, the design that saved lives. At first glance, a heat candle appears unremarkable. A tin can, some cardboard, a small amount of wax. Yet, within its unassuming shell, resides a structure far more sophisticated than it seems. For each component fulfills a crucial function. The metal container is not merely a holder, it acts as a radiator. Tin or steel absorbs the flame's energy and disperses it horizontally, releasing warmth at the precise height where cold hands and faces need it most. Instead of merely allowing warmth to dissipate upwards, the container transformed the flame into a small yet potent radiant heat source. Inside, tightly packed cardboard or cloth shaped a dense wick structure, substantially increasing the surface area. This configuration ensured a gradual and consistent burn, preventing a quick, wasteful burst of fire. The material acted like intricate capillaries, drawing liquefied wax upwards to continually fuel the flame at a regulated rate. The essential element was the fuel itself. Wax was the preferred option, often salvaged from damaged candles or leftover stubs. However, when wax became scarce, people resorted to tallow, grease, or even the oily residue from cooking fires. A common and effective ratio discovered across Europe was approximately 3 parts wax to 1 part cardboard or cloth. This mixture provided a prolonged, steady burn, generating sufficient heat to be effective while lasting throughout the night. Together, these components created a small device capable of producing usable heat for several hours from almost nothing. It lacked power and visual appeal, but it functioned. In the stark reality of survival, utility invariably triumphs over aesthetics. The remarkable quality of the heat candle wasn't its flame, but its effectiveness. It converted waste into energy and remnants into resources. Most importantly, it transformed knowledge into survival. This wasn't a clever trick. It was sophisticated energy management, an understanding of heat dynamics applied in the most unforgiving circumstances imaginable. The 7th crucial element was the transition from direct flame to radiant heat. The true genius of the survival heat candle lay not in its flame, but in what that flame became. Many mistakenly equate fire with warmth, an assumption that can be fatal in survival situations. Heat from an exposed flame rises rapidly, forming a thermal column that leaves a huddled person dangerously cold, even as hot air accumulates overhead. Flame heat is localized, unstable, and, critically, fails to sustain the body's core temperature. Radiant heat behaves differently. It doesn't ascend, it spreads outwards, touching the skin and warming the blood beneath the surface. This is biological warmth, essential for keeping hands functional, muscles responsive, and the heart beating rhythmically. When radiant heat contacts the skin, it thwarts the deadly progression of hypothermia, the gradual decline where numbness leads to confusion, then exhaustion, and ultimately silence. This principle of retaining heat where humans genuinely need it is one of history's oldest survival lessons. The Romans employed this concept in their hypercausts, directing heat beneath floors to radiate through stone. Northern Europeans constructed masonry stoves that stored fire within heavy brick walls, releasing warmth long after the flames died. Even the simple clay pot heaters in medieval homes operated on the same physics: capture heat, then release it slowly. The survival heat candle was a wartime evolution of these ancient systems, transforming the chaotic, fleeting energy of an open flame into consistent, skin-level warmth. This was more than ingenuity. It was the critical distinction between a beautiful flickering flame and a heat source that sustained life through the war's longest nights. The 8th point highlights the biological threshold, why a slight temperature difference can be life-saving. The ingenuity of the heat candle becomes evident when one comprehends the body's reaction to cold. Hypothermia doesn't begin when a room feels chilly, but when the body's core temperature dips below approximately 35 degrees Celsius. Beyond this point, bodily functions progressively fail. Fingers stiffen, dexterity diminishes, judgment falters, and the heart struggles. What often surprises people is that a dramatic increase in air temperature isn't necessary to halt this decline. The goal is merely to prevent the body from exceeding its biological breaking point. If hands maintain a temperature above approximately 10 degrees Celsius, blood continues to flow, and muscles remain functional. If the core temperature can be stabilized, even marginally, the full onset of hypothermia is averted. Survival isn't about feeling comfortable. It's about staying above the critical threshold where the body loses control. This is why radiant heat significantly surpasses warming the air. Air absorbs energy slowly and dissipates it quickly. In contrast, radiant heat, delivered directly to the skin, immediately strengthens the body's defenses. A person warmed by radiant heat regains dexterity, awareness, and mobility long before the ambient air temperature rises. This explains the scientific rationale behind every wartime survivor's account. A heat candle didn't provide comfort or melt frost from walls, but it kept the human body just above the point of collapse. It bought precious time, maintained circulation, and sustained life. In the bitter battles of World War II, survival didn't demand warmth, but rather that the body never cross the line where cold becomes lethal. The 9th point discusses multiplying heat, an accidental invention of a heat exchanger by civilians. While a single heat candle was impressive, what followed was even more ingenious. Across Europe, without direct communication or instructions, civilians discovered that multiple heat candles placed closely together produced an effect far greater than the sum of their individual flames. They also found that covering these candles with a clay pot, a metal bucket, or even a damaged cooking pot fundamentally altered heat distribution. Instead of flames rising and dissipating, the cover absorbed the ascending energy, storing it within its thick walls. Once heated, the pot radiated warmth outwards in every direction, creating a slow, consistent thermal pulse that persisted long after the flames had died down. This transformed a few improvised heaters into a crude yet effective heat exchanger, an unintentional recreation of the systems ancient civilizations constructed from stone and clay. The underlying physics is simple but profound. Thermal mass retains heat, and delayed radiation releases it gently. Together, they convert short-lived flame heat into sustained, usable warmth. A family gathered around such a setup could maintain flexible hands, prevent their breath from freezing, and keep their bodies above the collapse point for hours. Soldiers employed a similar method in field shelters, placing pots or metal helmets over clusters of candles to create a warm zone where gear could dry overnight. What makes this historical moment extraordinary is that thousands of individuals, separated by language, distance, and conflict, independently arrived at the same solution almost simultaneously. This wasn't engineering. It was instinct sharpened by extreme necessity. Through this instinct, they uncovered a truth more powerful than fire itself. They didn't need more heat. They simply needed to prevent what they already had from escaping. This was the essence of winter survival during World War II. They weren't striving to generate warmth, but to conserve it. Section 10 delves into safety, the delicate line between survival and oblivion. Despite its brilliance, the survival heat candle posed a danger as insidious as winter itself. Carbon monoxide and oxygen depletion, silent killers in enclosed spaces. These threats were odorless, painless, and provided no warning. Those who trusted the flame blindly often succumbed before realizing what was happening. Survivors understood one rule above all else. Ventilation was paramount. Even in the coldest rooms or bombed-out basements where every breath crystallized, They maintained an opening, a crack in a window, a removed broken brick, or a chimney slightly open to ensure air circulation. They knew that a minor heat loss was a small price for the oxygen that sustained them. Those who perished made the opposite mistake, believing that sealing every gap would trap warmth. Instead, it trapped poison. Many victims were found with candles still burning peacefully beside them, their bodies succumbing not to the cold, but to the air they could no longer breathe. It was a cruel irony. A tool designed to preserve life could take it away when used without respect. This is the harsh lesson winter teaches more ruthlessly than war itself. In extreme conditions, ignorance kills faster than cold. Fire, heat, and shelter are meaningless if the air turns hostile. The survivors of 1944 did not merely endure the cold. They learned to negotiate with it, understanding that survival is never just about adding warmth. It's about managing every interacting force, both visible and unseen. The 11th section explores forgotten variants, innovations born from necessity. While the standard heat candle design gained widespread adoption, countless variations emerged across Europe, each adapted to whatever materials people could scavenge. These overlooked versions underscore a fundamental truth about human resourcefulness. Survival rarely hinges on a single perfect design, but rather on continuous adaptation. Some families incorporated salt into the wax to reduce smoke, making their heaters safer within cramped shelters. Others discovered that adding pine pitch extended burn time, allowing a single candle to last through the longest night. When wax became entirely unavailable, people resorted to animal fat, cooking grease, or solidified drippings scraped from abandoned kitchens. Anything that could melt and burn became fuel. But ingenuity extended beyond fuel. A heat candle evolved into a miniature survival station. Soldiers used it to dry socks and gloves, preventing them from freezing to their skin overnight. Civilians placed cups of water nearby to keep the liquid from solidifying. Weapons were positioned within its gentle, steady warmth to prevent firing mechanisms from icing over. Within certain shelters, families ingeniously repurposed heat candles to warm thin sheets of metal or clay, converting them into makeshift thermal radiators. This transformed the simple object into a sophisticated system, a miniature ecosystem designed for warmth, moisture regulation, equipment preservation, and human resilience. Every modification was a narrative. A family discovering a new method to endure, a soldier learning an additional stratagem to ward off frostbite, a community sharing knowledge to aid the next household's survival. The heat candle was not a singular invention, but rather a vast field of innovations, countless minor adjustments, each silently preserving lives during a winter for which the world was utterly unprepared. 12. The constraints of the heat candle. Candor fosters trust. To fully grasp the true significance of the heat candle, we must also acknowledge its limitations. It lacks the capacity to warm a large chamber, cannot serve as a replacement for a stove, nor does it offer a viable, long-term heating solution. Furthermore, its use in poorly ventilated spaces can pose a hazard. The warmth it provides is modest, unassuming, and delicate. Yet, these very limitations underscore the profound impact of its success. For during the most perilous nights of WWII, survival demanded not comfort, but merely a few crucial degrees. just enough to maintain hand functionality, prevent respiratory distress, and keep the heart from succumbing to hypothermia's dreadful descent. The heat candle was never intended to facilitate comfortable living. Rather, it inadvertently enabled people to merely survive long enough. It carved out a narrow sanctuary of life amidst a world gripped by ice, and that proved sufficient. On a night plummeting to -20 degrees Celsius, luxury is irrelevant. Expansive warmth blanketing the room is unnecessary. All that is required is remaining above the critical threshold where cold morphs into death. The heat candle did not preserve homes, it preserved lives. And sometimes that stands as the most honest definition of survival. 13. Conclusion. When history does not murmur, but admonishes. The individuals who endured the winter of 1944 were neither inherently stronger nor more sagacious, gifted, or prepared than us. What they possessed was an acute comprehension of physics, biology, and the razor-thin divide between existence and extinction. They recognized that survival is not an act of heroism, but a scientific, practical, and disciplined endeavor. They deciphered the behavior of heat, understood the mechanisms of bodily failure, and learned to navigate the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. Their invaluable lesson continues to confront us today, as pertinent now as it was amidst the frozen ruins of World War II. In both conflict and cold, history does not merely whisper, it instructs with clarity, sharpness, and relentless insistence. The fundamental choice before us is whether to opt for